It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We're going to have an amazing week for you guys all this week. A lot of things kind of planned out. Obviously, we're in the veto period for the legislative session here in Kentucky. These are about the 2 weeks where anything that's been passed by the legislature last Wednesday, Thursday, they're pretty much done with all their major pieces of legislation. The only things that get passed in the last 2 days are either constitutional amendments or the kinds of things that we wish they would never pass in the first place, because they're things that, of course, Beshear would greatly agree with, things that they've made deals on, probably the kinds of things that if you're a conservative, if you're a Republican conservative, you probably won't like any kind of major legislation that passes those last 2 days. But we are in our veto period, waiting for the governor to make the decisions on the bills he has on his desk. I hope everybody had a great Easter. If you want to check out old shows, head on over to theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com. So one of the things I've talked about a number of times on the show is just how difficult it is to actually get this legislature, to actually get this General Assembly that is 80% registered Republican. Keep that in mind. Over in the House, they have 80 seats registered Republican. Over in the Senate, I believe they have 31 that are registered Republican, 31 seats registered Republican. And so it's a very conservative legislature. And so you'd think it'd be kind of easy to get done very conservative things. But if this session taught us anything at all, it was that it is still very, very difficult to get conservative things done, even with this supermajority. A lot of good things died that shouldn't have died. A lot of things that there's this like war going on between a basic understanding, a basic philosophical idea of not just what is government's role, but what is government's role? What is our educational system here in Kentucky supposed to look like? What is K through 12 education's role even? I mean, that's another question we have before us. And as evidence of that, we need but turn to Senate Bill 2. Now, a lot of people got something wrong on Senate Bill 2. I did on my last show. I was operating off of a few things I saw reporters kind of sending out, because it's hard to see. See, the way this works, they update bills online like the day after. And so if you're trying to see most up-to-date bill, most up-to-date amendments, what's filed, what's actually passed for sure, if you didn't watch it live and then double check that with, some people in the legislature while it's happening live, it's hard to know exactly what passed. So everybody thought Senate Bill 2, which was a school safety bill, it was originally sold and started out as just a bill looking at dealing with something called these guardians in our K through 12 education. Basically, a year or two ago, our legislature passed a bill saying that, hey, you have to have an SRO in these K through 12 schools. You've got to have a police officer to provide security and, of course, protect schools, protect kids, deal with these situations that are going on inside our schools. And one of the problems some of these places have had is finding somebody who fits the description, somebody who's, a police officer and can take the role. And so what they were allowing to do in this bill, I don't know if Beshear signs it or not, but what they're allowed to do is go ahead and hire retired police officers or people who've been honorably discharged from the military within the past 5 years and give them, basically double check their trainings, a little bit of different trainings and things like that, but basically be able to onboard them right away as what's called guardians in order to fill the role of these school resource officers, these police officers in the schools, until the schools can actually find a police officer to hire. That's what the bill started out to do. But it had a bunch of other things in there. And those things started to become, obviously, a little bit of an issue. And a great example of this is there's a part of the bill that is dealing with filing reports to Homeland Security, where schools are to provide data that's supposed to be anonymous, but data on the environment, on situations, on what's going on inside their schools to the Department of Homeland Security. That's a problem. But another problem that people saw with this bill was in this trauma response team. And one of the things that everybody's gotten wrong, and I got wrong, and Renee Shaw even tweeted about this, got it wrong. Austin Horn, political reporter at the Herald Leader, tweeted about this, got this wrong. I haven't seen any political reporter report, though, the accurate truth. And there was a belief that the trauma response team that was in this bill, one of the things that got added to it, or supposedly had gotten added to it in committee, was a pastoral counselor. And those of you who listened to my Friday show know that I went through what is the pastoral counselor, who approves these people, is this a good idea and bad idea? And I laid out that I thought the amendment as a whole actually wasn't that great because of the way that it was picking who would be a pastoral counselor was according to this organization that, you know, it doesn't guarantee obviously that they'd be Christian, and that would be unconstitutional. There's got to be some more things in here, like parents pick, you know, can pick the religion of the pastoral counselor. They can pick, you know, whether they want one or not. Those kinds of things have to be engaged on this. But, you know, there was no requirement of who it is and how they train them. And the point that I made up, well, I'm not made up, but point I made on Friday was, you know, I've been talking this week about schools in Fayette County. I pointed out one middle school in Fayette County that had rainbow flags and BLM and everything else, like 6 or 7 instances of political messaging within just their cafeteria. And a lot of that political messaging goes against the Christian belief. And so I asked you the question, who do you think that school would hire to be the pastoral counselor? Do you think it would be your Southern Baptist preacher, or do you think it's going to be one of these hippy-dippy new, you know, hippie Jesus people, right? Who are they going to throw out there? And so I brought that up to say, you know, I'm not super big fan of it. Now, the bill sponsor, or that amendment sponsor who wanted it in there, Josh Calloway, said, well, and basically his idea behind it was, yeah, we could go back in, though. Once this starts, there's only like 30 or so people who are even certified by the organization that Kentucky recognizes as a certified pastoral counselor. And so once it's in there, you can start to kind of pass some legislation to expand that out, change how they're being approved, what is the actual process and policies there. Schools can shape their policies, those kinds of ideas. And so while I understand what he's saying, I don't necessarily love the amendment, but it was, in their opinion, on a bill that was bad because the trauma response team, it was a way to kind of help maybe make it just a little bit better, a little bit easier to swallow. Because the way it was looking, it wasn't going to pass in committee. Senate Bill 2 wasn't going to pass in committee because of the trauma response teams that was required in the bill. Because a lot of people, a lot of conservatives like myself, and hopefully you, recognize that the more we ask our schools to do these things, the more we ask our schools to not worry about teaching reading, writing, and math, and we start talking to them about social emotional learning and your feelings and how does that make you feel and blah, 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 blah. The more our schools do that, the worse our students are getting. And schools, the more they wade into that, are becoming these endless black pits of money. And it's just getting unbearable. And so this bill was going to die without this amendment. So you'd say, okay, so it should have passed and it should have been on there. Well, there's more to this story about exactly what happened and why all the media got it wrong too on why the pastoral counselors portion of that bill actually did not pass. Even though it didn't become law. We'll be going over that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Before the break, I was talking about Senate Bill 2, and I talked about this on Friday, and it was the belief of mine, as well as many, many people, in our media that that bill had passed with pastoral counselors. Why did we think that? And by pastoral counselors, sorry, I should clarify, it passed with, they created these trauma response teams in Senate Bill 2. And what these trauma response teams were, they weren't just responding to, like a suicide in the family, some sort of drastic issue. No, what they do is they respond to any kind of trauma. So it could just simply be, I'm kind of depressed, to, hey, my parents just passed away. And this response team is supposed to come in, grab a hold of these students, and set them up with a counselor, a person to talk to help them deal with their feelings. And the point I made before the break is that, the reason why a lot of people were against this trauma response team is because, one, this has become a black pit of money for these schools. The more they get involved with these emotional, psychiatric care, counseling care things, they just keep spending more and more money. Administration grows and all this expense grows, but our kids aren't doing better in school. And then on top of that, when we look at the results of what they're doing, so you think, well, we're spending all this money. Yeah, it's not showing itself in an academic way, but at least maybe it's showing itself in children's mental health. But you'd be mistaken. The children's mental health has gotten worse as schools have started to do this more and more and more. Mental health is declining. Suicide rates are increasing. They're not good at this. And they're not good at this because there's been recently a lot of research on this, because some people have realized we're increasing our amount of attention we're paying to these children's issues, but yet they're not getting better. Why is that? And so that research is coming out the same reason, because you're having these kids talk about their feelings all day long, and it's not helping them get better because they're kids. Stop making them feel bad all the time talking about their feelings and just let them be kids. That's kind of what the research tends to be pointing at now, but putting that to the side. So a lot of people had issue with it within the Education Committee in the House, and so the deal was made. Not really deal, but basically the pastoral counselor edition is what won over the votes that was needed for this bill to pass the Education Committee, and it headed to the floor. Well, the chair of the Education Committee, Representative Tipton, didn't make a motion to roll the committee amendment into the bill. So when Senate Bill 2 hit the floor, even though the committee passed the amendment, because the chair, keep in mind, he's doing the bidding of leadership here, but the chair didn't follow the right procedural motions. So when Senate Bill 2 hit the floor, the amendment that passed in committee wasn't on the bill. Even when things are voted for and pass that they don't want, but do end up passing, they will literally figure out ways to ignore the vote of the entire body. But they had a new problem, because that amendment to the bill adding the pastoral counselors was still out there. Now, they didn't want that. Thought the people over in the Senate wouldn't like it. There's an issue going on right now with leadership and doing things that appear too conservative. We'll talk about later. And so they didn't want it to pass. They said if that amendment was on there, they believed that bill would be dead. And they wanted to make sure it passed. But you got a problem, because that amendment didn't pass in committee, but the amendment is now available to be called up on the floor. And that's a problem. Going now, for some of you may remember, on, was it House Bill 278, where Jay Williams added on an amendment to require the verification of age for pornography websites, or parents can sue pornography websites for not taking proper steps to make sure that, if they're serving up pornography illegally to their kids, then parents can do something about it. Because, and I know we've had many debates and talked about this a lot on the show. I'm not going to redebate it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I support the bill, and if you disagree with me, go back and listen to old shows. I'm right, you're wrong. So anyways, but they didn't want to call that bill either now, because it was too conservative. That was going to be dead in the House on the concurrence vote. And so the deal that was made And this is what I'm told. The deal that was made was, okay, don't call your amendment to Senate Bill 2 to add the pastoral counselors onto the trauma team, and we'll go ahead and pass 278 with age verification for pornography, something we didn't want to pass to begin with. So they didn't want to pass trauma, but they also didn't want to pass pornography verification. And I guess they decided that they didn't want the pastoral counselors on the trauma response team in the K through 12 schools more than they cared more about that not being on there than they cared about protecting the pornography industry. This just leads to a big question of, like, even when they do something conservative, it happens by accident. You may remember Senate Bill 150 banned all kinds of things. Banned, gender transition surgeries, sex change drugs for minors, gender change surgeries for minors. Kids got to use the biological bathroom at school. No, those kinds of things. It did a lot about protecting kids from this weird gender push to turn kids into sexual beings. It's just really weird what they're doing here, but it was to protect them getting body parts lopped off and basically buying into this lie that you can change your gender as a child. We're not going to do this. We're not going to buy into this. This is lifelong changes. We're not going to do that. And this person's a child and doesn't even understand what they're doing. But if you remember that bill, everybody champions it now. Everybody sits there and says, look what we passed. We're amazing in the legislature. They didn't want that to pass. It passed accidentally. Funny enough, after Josh Calloway made a compelling floor speech about it, and if you will rewind a few days before the end of session, Josh Calloway made an impassionate floor speech and tried to make some motions in order to get a bill passed banning pornography websites from showing porn to children. And they gavelled him down. They told him he wasn't allowed to do that. But here, we were able to get another bill passed accidentally because they had to make a deal to get one of their key pieces of legislation passed that had something in it that they didn't want because of the games they're playing. It happened accidentally. You may ask yourself, why are they doing this? Why are they not doing their jobs here? What is going on? And you can chalk it up to a lot of things, but what it has come down to is power, period. Plain straight power. That's what they're worried about. And there's this belief amongst our legislators and leadership in Frankfurt that if they do conservative things, if they quote unquote go too far, then they'll lose power in Frankfurt. And they won't be in control anymore. And so they're keeping themselves reined in from going too conservative because they say, well, we'll get replaced by the Democrats, which I think is foolhardy and short-sighted for a few reasons. First, it doesn't matter if you have the power unless you do something with it. And that is something that our legislators don't seem to want to do. Anything conservative with the power that they have. And if they do anything with the power that they have, it's corrupt and it's awful most of the time because they're doing it in order to serve the people who are giving them the money so they can continue to hold on to that power. So, that's one of the reasons why. They think if I go too strong, we're going to lose elections. Of course, this ignores any part of history of the state. Democrats had power for 100 years and they went too far in their minds, and that's why Democrats lost. But keep in mind, Democrats, if you pay attention to your history, Democrats didn't lose our state legislature because of actions Democrats were making in our state legislature. Democrats lost because of the actions Democrats were doing at the federal level. When it comes to state politics, it really doesn't matter as much. Or if it does, and you do have a group of people voting Republican in your state, they reward you doing conservative things. They joined your party for a reason. This is what's crazy. Is these Republicans look around And they don't realize why people are joining your party. These longtime Republicans in leadership, in our Senate, in our House, they don't realize why the Republican Party is growing in Kentucky. And it's not because of monetary things, clearly, because the Republicans aren't handling that great anyways. We'll go over that in a bit. It's not monetary things. It's the social issues. They don't want to be a part of a party that's advocating for these far left crazy social issues. And if you can stand up there and say, we want to protect kids, we want to fight back against these social issues, we don't want your tax dollars being used for that anymore. If you can stand up there and say that and follow through, you will be rewarded. Nobody looks at what, for an example, Florida's doing and thinks that is necessarily moderate. Florida's ahead of the curve about every single other state on trying to pass good conservative legislation, it appears like. Coming from Kentucky, seeing what they're doing, seeing the headlines, following some of the bills, talking to the people I know that live in Florida, it seems like they're ahead of the curve. And they're rewarded with bigger and greater Republican victories. You think they'd take note from that and do better here in Kentucky, but instead, we have to get our conservative things passed here in Kentucky accidentally. And in doing so, they end up creating a session also that serves nobody. And as evidence of that, we'll go over the budget, some other things. After this short break, you'll listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Like I said, we're wrapping up session. We got 2 more days left here in 2 weeks after the veto period. The number one takeaway I have, I was thinking about this yesterday, day before yesterday, Saturday, Friday. I was thinking about how would I describe this session, because in my opinion, I think it was pretty awful. And I'll have a few episodes this week where I talk about that, but I'll probably wait till session's officially over, and I'll do probably a few shows where, I go through the good, the bad, the ugly about what happened to kind of point out why I think this session was pretty awful, probably one of the worst ones in recent memory. I want to point out how this quickly is a session, and my thoughts about it is that this is a session for nobody. Like, the only people coming out of this happy are the special interests, the lobbyists. None of the conservative base is happy. Most Democrats aren't happy. And they're not happy because they look at the results of the session. Take, for an example, Senate Bill 6. Senate Bill 6 was the anti-DEI bill. And it's funny because it came out of the legislature. This is fascinating. So it came out of the legislature saying you can't, out of the Senate, saying you can't teach DEI. But it wasn't specifically defunding the DEI offices in our colleges and universities. It was just saying you can't teach as a required class these critical race theory, these kinds of things. And then they got a hold of it in the House, and Jennifer Decker changed the bill. And she basically changed the bill to where some of what Senate Bill 6, in my opinion, I think it loosened up a bit what could be taught in the classroom. Because it just said you couldn't teach it coming out of the Senate. And now it said you could teach it, but you couldn't teach it as fact. It had to be up for debate. And if you wanted to teach it as fact, or you could teach it as fact, but it couldn't be required. So if you taught it, if it's required to teach, these DEI ideas, if you wanted part of a class as required, then you just have to make sure that you present it as a debatable idea and you allow debate on it. If, however, you put it up there as a non-required class, you can pretty much teach whatever. So that's why I said I think it was a little bit less when it came to actual classroom instruction. But the reason why Senate Bill 6 didn't pass is because it defunds a lot of the DEI spending going on the colleges and universities, especially the DEI offices on the colleges and universities, where they couldn't no longer institute policies of DEI hiring. They could no longer institute policies of preferring one race over the other. They could no longer put in place policies where they would treat people differently based upon their skin color. Something you think everybody would agree with, but of course, because DEI is racism, because it advocates for treating people differently based upon their skin color, So, you think people would agree with that, but they're racist. So, now the reason why it didn't pass, people ask us, why didn't it pass? It has to do with Aaron Thompson. Aaron Thompson is the head of the Council on Post-Secondary Education here in Kentucky. And he's got a real good grip there in the Senate. He's good friends with Stivers, David Givens, listens to him a lot up there. And so Aaron Thompson's the head of basically the group that represents and runs and kind of handles our colleges and universities. And Aaron Thompson, this is why he had such a big problem with Senate Bill 6, because it says you can't spend money on these ideas in your colleges and universities, and you can't require these classes. So you say, why would Aaron Thompson throw such a fit to it? Why is he so tied into it? Well, it's because Aaron Thompson isn't just the director of CPE or the head of it. He's also a textbook author. Let me tell you some of the textbooks he's wrote. Diversity, Anti-Racism, and the College Experience. Implementing Innovative Leadership in an Inclusive Learning Environment. Infusing Equity and Culture and Competence into Teacher Development. Humanity, Diversity, and the Liberal Arts, the Foundation of a College Education. So he's wrote several textbooks that are required reading in a lot of these classes. Sit there and say, why didn't Senate Bill 6 pass? Why didn't it pass? It didn't pass because Aaron Thompson didn't want it to pass. And he's got more control over your legislature, specifically the Senate leadership, than you do, than the voters do. Wake up to it, Kentucky. They don't care what you think. This was one of their key issues. It received a low bill number. Senate Bill 6, normally 1 through 10, means that is a priority issue for that chamber. It was given Senate Bill 6. There's press conferences about it. Media hits about it. They're pushing it like crazy. But then the minute it actually was touching the bottom line for these DEI people, like Aaron Thompson, they had to back off of it. Didn't pass it. And it ends up becoming a move for nobody, because here's the dirty little secret. All the Democrats still hate you for ever considering the bill in the first place. They all hate you. But what's worse is the people you would have won over, the conservatives, the Republicans, your voting base, if you throw an R behind your name and you're in office, you now have angered them. You've lost them. So you created all the headlines to anger the left. You didn't pass it because that angers the right, and you didn't pass it for corrupt reasons, because you got the guy heading up our colleges in the state, our public universities in the state, who's writing textbooks on the subject you're trying to defund. And then you wonder how the people are going to react to it. You're so worried about losing power. And I've said this before, you're worried about Republicans losing power. While your moves may keep Republicans in power, at some point you're going to have to realize they're going to cost you power. Something will change. There will be a breaking point. Because this obvious corruption cannot continue without there being repercussions. It's not going to happen. It can't continue. People are coming out of this session, and you started a whole lot of things. You started a bill on DEI in colleges and universities. I mean, you could have just done a bill on DEI in K through 12, but I guess that would also hurt Aaron Thompson's bottom line if he's peddling textbooks to them too, so couldn't do that. But you could have done K through 12, something I actually say you should have done before you look at colleges and universities, but you didn't. You had a bill on it, didn't move it. You literally sat on a bill for several days that banned DEI offices in colleges and universities, and you just didn't pass it. You just sat on it, pointing to everybody that, there's some corruption here because you sat on it for so long. You tried to not roll in a dutifully passed amendment out of a chamber. I mean, look, they're going to come calling. The chickens are going to come home to roost here eventually. And you all that are stopping things because you're worried about Republicans being in power need to start to think if you want to remain in power. And I get it. You think money is going to save you. You think if you dump enough money into challengers against conservative people, people like Doan and Emily Callaway, Josh Callaway, and Candy Massaroni, and Marion Proctor and Steve Rawlings, and all the other incumbents that are either running for higher office or running for re-election. Savannah Maddox, Felicia Rayborn. You think if you dump money and time and effort against them and you can take them down, that'll send a message to everybody else. But I got to tell you this much. I think you're out over your skis here. I think you have more power and money than you think you have. I think you are unrealized, especially in the House, how much harder it's becoming to buy those elections, because you can get out there and knock doors, and the community matters, and the community's turning to their local important people. Whether they're their party chairs, the local grassroots, whatever it may be, and asking them what's going on. And they're getting their information from them. They're not getting their information anymore from the ads and cards, or at least you hope to see that trend. And we can see in the election outcomes in what counties where that's happening. When we come back, we'll go over a little bit about the budget. After this short break, you'll listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So we've been talking about a little bit about this session. I want to go over the budget, just some high overview on the budget points that I want to make. And one of those points, and more evidence of what I was talking about in the last segment, how these colleges and universities are the tail wagging the dog. They're funded through your dollars. The state government's supposed to be in charge of what they do. The legislature is supposed to be in charge of what they do. You elect these state house reps and state senators into office to represent you. So they're supposed to be the dog that you put in place to wag the tail that is our post-secondary institutions. But as evidenced with Senate Bill 6, they're able to, that tail's wagging the dog. And further evidence of this, we need but look at our budget bill. This is from our budget bill. It's a massive bill, 268 pages long. On page 142, though, it gives immunity for post-secondary institutions for claims, including class action lawsuits, for damages, declaratory judgments, and equitable relief based on an act of omission if the claim arises out of or in connection with tuition paid to the public post-secondary institution for the academic term that included the months of March, April, and May 2020. The claim alleges losses or damages arising from an act or omission by the public post-secondary institution during or in response to the COVID-19 emergency. But in the budget basically is saying, because there's been these lawsuits against University of Kentucky's and others regarding tuition payments during 2020, 2021, COVID-19 kind of thing, where they sent kids home, they were having kids, Zoom into classes, they weren't letting them come to university, they're having them learn on their computers, stuck in their dorm rooms, not living that full college experience, that thing they're going into massive amounts of debt for, the thing that they're paying so much for. They weren't able to get that. And so they were suing, saying, look, we should have some of our funds returned to us. And it was going in their direction. The courts had ruled that, yeah, they need to have some of their funds returned. They can seek out refunds. Well, not anymore, because the legislature here in this budget has given them immunity for any actions they took in regards to COVID at these colleges and universities. More evidence that the tail's wagging the dog. And if you want to look at, my point about this being a session for nobody, just look at the budget. The budget, what they just passed, goes to the governor. He'll line item veto maybe some things. They'll probably try to overcome it. To sum it up, that budget that they passed there, on average, over the next 2 years, because remember how our budgets work in Kentucky. They do 2 years at a time. So they budget 2 years, 1 year's a little bit higher, second year's normally a bit lower, but they do 2 years at a time. So the budget we just passed has an average yearly spending of $64.2 billion and has about $3 billion-ish in one-time spending in addition to that, and just south of about $4 billion in new debt. And give you an idea of how much money that $64.2 billion is, our prior 2-year budget, remember we had all that COVID money too, our prior 2-year budget, we spent on average $52.6 billion. So naturally, as a conservative, you should already have issues with the budget. If you're a small government person, you'd say we need to spend less, not more than we ever have before, which is what they're doing. They'll pound their chest and say this is the most conservative budget we've ever done, even though it's more money than they've ever spent before. Most conservative though, don't you see? So as a conservative, you take issues with it, but you look at what the Democrats are saying. You've got Andy Beshear out here upset that universal pre-K ain't in it. He's upset about not enough spending for, child care. Some people are upset about that. You got some people that are upset over, not enough funding to the schools. People are upset over the teachers' raises on the left because they didn't have a line item for teachers' raises, which, as they pointed out, might be unconstitutional. So they just increased SEEK funding a little bit more, but they're still unhappy about it. But you have the left, Democrats, upset at the budget. You got conservatives upset at the budget, where a lot of the more conservative members voted no because there's so much pork in the darn thing. The only person that seems to be happy with this budget is the mayor of Louisville. He's elated. He's over the moon. In fact, he put out this video about the budget. Let's take a listen just to what he had to say.
Today, we're celebrating the historic and transformative investments of over $600 million that the General Assembly has invested in our city, our university, and is going to benefit the entire state. Special thanks to the House and Senate leadership, to President Stivers, Senator Rocky Adams, Senator Neal, Speaker Osborne, Representative Nemes, the entire Jefferson County delegation, and every member of the General Assembly who worked together in a bipartisan fashion to make these historic and transformative investments. Over $200 million is being invested across our entire city in downtown revitalization, in our parks, needed infrastructure improvements, improving cultural organizations and community social service groups across our entire city, from west to east and north to south and every neighborhood in between. And on top of that, over $400 million in University of Louisville. These are great investments that are going to benefit the lives of our city and the entire state. Again, a special thanks to everyone in the General Assembly. We are truly moving our city and our state in a new direction, and we're just getting started.
He says they're just getting started. Just getting started as companies are pulling out of downtown Louisville. Even gas stations can't survive due to the retail theft. They're packing up. They're leaving out of there. So other than the mayor in Louisville, maybe Louisville Democrats, who, FYI Republicans, they'll never vote for you. But anyways, other than them, conservatives, they just aren't happy either. Tomorrow I'll go over some of the specific spending items, especially the one-time items and some of the stories behind them, where you get a real clear idea of how much lobbyists and dollars are buying the influence and buying your resources that the government takes from you. We'll go into that. But the issue isn't just how much you're spending, it's who you're giving this to. Keep in mind, you didn't pass Senate Bill 6, but you're giving hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, just there in the video, you heard him say, what? University of Louisville's getting $400 million? But you won't pass DEI reform in these universities, and they're spending tens of millions of money on that. And now what? We're throwing good money after bad? The schools are failing. And instead of addressing what they're blowing our money on, because they're black pit money holes, and they blow money on everything but teaching kids to read and do math. So instead of dealing with that issue, what do? You pass a massive budget, more spending, more money. And by the way, we're going to continue to provide incentives, $2,000 a year incentives for teachers to go get DEI trainings at groups that tell them to set up racial struggle groups within their schools. In order to become certified counselor there, that's a class you have to take. From the group, this professional educator certification course that the state of Kentucky pays teachers an additional $2,000 a year to get, that's some of the stuff they push. Using your money. You got $1.5 million going to the Grand Lyric Theater in Louisville. This is a new construction project that is already over budget. It's a nonprofit who's building it. They started out in 2019 saying it was going to cost $2 million. They need to raise $2 million. And they had already $900,000 in 2019. And then supposedly they had raised even more money since then. And they basically had enough proposed by private interests and other funding sources that they'd be able to go ahead and build this theater. That's what they stated. And that was before the state kicked in money. Now the state is kicking in $750,000 a year over the next 2 years, so another $1.5 million into this what was supposed to be $2 million project that already had well over $1 million in funding into it. That's what I'm talking about. It's like you dump money into these money pits. And you know, of course, the group associated with it is super pushing DEI and everything else, but outside of that, it's already over budget. So conservatives are mad at the budget. Dems are mad at the budget. Who's it for then? Who was it for? It's for the special interests, not for your voters. Well, y'all, that's what we have time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back here tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.